Welcome to another episode of the Break It Down for Brackens podcast. Today we get to hear from Katie Bochinski. Katie is going to educate me and us on tarot cards. Today's podcast is brought to you by Brackens Painting LLC, which is a painting company that I started about 10 years ago. We specialize in residential and commercial painting. At this time, during the COVID-19 crisis, we are exceptionally busy and exceptionally understaffed. So if you do need work done, let's hope to schedule it sometime in the summer or fall. This podcast is also brought to you by City National Bank. You'll hear their ad at the end of the podcast. This is a very special podcast because this is the first video podcast. I broke out the old GoPro Hero 4. I think they're on the GoPro 10s now. So it's an old school video and I only had one good angle, so I set it up on Katie. So basically for the entire podcast, you hear both of us, but you only see her. Maybe in the future we'll get more cameras and see how that plays out when that happens. But anyways, let's listen to what Katie has to say. Hello, Katie. Thank you so much for being on the Break It Down for Brackens podcast.
Hi.
Hi. Relax. This is going to be a great conversation. As you heard in the intro, we are talking about tarot cards, and some programming that Katie's putting together here in the community. Katie, let's start off with your background. Tell me about where you're from, where you went to school, where have you worked. Let us know about Katie Bochinski.
Well, hi. I'm 33 years old. I grew up in West Virginia, even though I was born in Dover, Delaware. I'm from the Eastern Panhandle, went to Hedgesville High School, moved on to WVU after that. I studied engineering, English literature, spent some time, about almost 8 years in Morgantown, actually. And then I moved back to the Eastern Panhandle area where my family lives. And, yeah.
Engineering? What kind of engineering?
Well, after school, I worked in the service industry for a long time, kind of floated around. Then I felt like I wanted to get my, big girl job. So I started out as a soil and concrete technician. I started commuting into the Virginia area, doing a lot of structural engineering. I worked for GTA, which is a geotechnical firm. They do mostly foundation work, testing soil, testing concrete and stuff. So I was a technician at first, traveled around to a lot of places in Virginia.
What does a technician do?
So I actually did the entire foundation for the Cabela's in Gainesville. So basically, they took a lot and they dig up the foundation. They take a lot of dirt samples, things like that, to make sure the dirt is appropriate to build on. And then you have a technician, which was me. I would go out on site every day, and they would refill in the dirt that they dug up, and then they have to compact it at every 8 inches. And so you have to go around and test it to make sure it's compacted appropriately, so that when you build on it, you don't have any cracks in your foundation.
Right. So I guess if it wasn't compacted, well, if you're testing the soil, you're looking for what would be a bad thing to find in the soil?
When you think about dirt, there's 4 types. There's gravel, sand, silt, and clay. Mm-hmm. So you have to have an appropriate balance in there. So if dirt is too wet, it's mud, and if dirt is too dry, it's dust, right? So essentially what I would do is I would take a nuclear gauge, right? This was radioactive material. I would drive into Sterling. It's in a 60-pound lead box, so it was really interesting. I had to carry this thing out, put it in my trunk. I had to chain it up and lock it up because it's radioactive material. It's essentially... if you can picture a box and, in the cartoons where you have, they push the thing down for the TNT bomb, well, it's like that. So you basically go out into the dirt and you stick a rod down into the dirt about a foot deep. And what it does is it measures the moisture in the dirt. So there's a perfect amount of moisture in that you want to find for each sample of dirt that you have. So it's called a proctor. So essentially I would test to make sure that the moisture was at the exact level for maximum compaction of that dirt, because you want the dirt to be the most compacted. You don't want it to be too wet and you don't want it to be too dry. So I was essentially testing the moisture content of the dirt every 8 inches that they compacted. So I would just have to hang out there with construction workers all day. We'd fill in the dirt. They'd go through with these compacting machines. I would go in and test it. If it wasn't compacted enough, if the moisture content wasn't right, they'd have to go and compact it again. So it was a lot of hard work, lots of being out in the sun, lots of being out in the dust. It was, had to wear hard hats, steel-toed boots. I carried around a sledgehammer.
All right.
Yeah, it was really awesome. So you have to go out there and you have a big, almost like a big railroad pin, right? And so you have to make the hole in the dirt ahead of time. So you go out there with the sledgehammer, put the hole in the dirt, put the box on, push it down, and then you'd have to. So essentially what's happening is the uranium, the radioactive material, is in the end of that rod, and your sensor is above the dirt in the box. And so the radioactive emissions would affect the reading, would be affected by the moisture. So
Gotcha.
That's how it would test the moisture. So
Wow.
I even had to wear a gauge that tested the amount of radioactivity.
Right.
So what was interesting about that, it was a lot of hard work. It was super interesting to learn, but it was really hard. I actually bought a pink hard hat because I was like the only female ever anywhere.
Yeah, on a construction site, that's
So
distracting.
I just started to own it. But really, you had to wear a radioactive gauge, and if you got pregnant or wanted to start a family or anything, like, you couldn't actually do the job because of the risk involved. So it really wasn't a career that I wanted to invest heavily in. So I actually switched from doing the field work. I got a job closer to home in Winchester, and I started working for a structural engineering firm that still did that kind of testing, but actually had a bigger, broader scope of work. So it was called Alpha Corporation. They're in Winchester, a really great company. I worked for them for years and got a little bit more into the office side, office engineering. I did a project. My biggest project there was Glacier National Park. We did a structural renovation of a hotel. It was on the side of a lake. It's pretty interesting. They actually had to wrap chains around the building, lift it up, and then drill micro piles, which is drilling down into where they find some bedrock, and then putting rebar and cement down there. Really cool. I got to travel out there for free and see the sites and everything. I worked with a lot of great people there. So it was still in that structural foundation work, really interesting. But I did more, I got started at Alpha in what's called SharePoint. And there's a lot of people out there that as soon as I say that, they're just going to flip out because everybody knows SharePoint. It's these big, sort of like an FTTP site where they share documents and information.
Uh-huh.
But it's really fancy, and you have to build the sites out. So I got into a lot of web building and just, organization and stuff like that. But yeah, that's pretty much my engineering background.
That's cool. And your family comes from that?
Sure. Yeah, my dad's an electrical, mechanical engineer. He works on drawbridges, hydroelectric power plants. Yeah, he travels everywhere. So.
And you don't do that anymore?
No, engineering's tough, and I really didn't like commuting, to be honest with you. And there's sort of this thing with engineering where, you have to kind of go to the job site. It doesn't come to you all the time. So that was hard for me. That was a challenge. So one of the things I had also really enjoyed in college, because I really hadn't made up my mind what I wanted to do when I was in school, but I studied a lot of English literature, and, math and language are really close to each other, I guess, in the brain. So I studied a lot during that time, a lot of like deep reading and doing a lot of research. So that was another thing that I enjoyed doing as I was like studying and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So my dad did influence me in the engineering, but also he's big on games, Magic, Dungeons and Dragons, if you guys are familiar with that. So I did read a lot of fantasy, sci-fi, fiction growing up, and was kind of nerdy into that sort of magical realm. Always liked fairies, always thought that was, the magic was in the mundane and in nature and things like that. So I was studying tarot at the time, actually, just for personal gain. So.
Well, you just dropped tarot on me, so I have no idea what tarot is or what it's for and how it's used. So I guess define tarot. Tell me what it is. Tell anybody who's listening what it is, and go as detailed as you want to.
Well, a lot of people, they have an idea of what tarot is. They tend to interpret it in the very taboo way. A lot of people are afraid of it. They're very scared of psychics. They're very scared of mediums.
It's typically in a psychic industry.
Sure. Fortune tellers. I think everyone's really familiar with the cliches about tarot.
Okay.
What was that commercial? The psychic that was always on. What was her name? It was like 1-800. Can't remember.
I can't remember.
Do you remember that?
No.
You know what I'm talking about?
I think I do, but I can't remember. I can't remember what they said.
That lady that was always on the TV called Miss Cleo.
That's right. Yeah.
So a lot of people, interpret tarot that way. Devil worship comes up a lot. Very
Really?
Orthodox religions tend to look at it as sort of, a sin, maybe, or something sort of negative or evil even. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot of cliches, misconceptions about tarot out there. I tend to see tarot as a more scholarly endeavor.
Okay.
So what tarot is, it's a couple of things. First, there's tarot as it began, and then there's tarot as it is today, because there's definitely been a huge transformation in what it really is. So really what it is 78 cards. Each card has a picture on it, and it's used in a variety of different ways. So do you want to know about the background of tarot first?
Yeah,
tell there's
me,
a lot to it.
Yeah, so tell me kind of where it first showed up. Tell me where, wow, I'm sorry, I was just distracted by a giant groundhog just ran by the COVID-19 studios. Did you see that? You didn't see him?
I didn't.
Yeah, hey, sorry. Totally distracted
okay.
me. It's a massive groundhog. Back to the podcast. I guess give me 2 to 3 minutes about, did it start like in Italy? Did it start in the Middle East? Like what's the background? And then after that, let's talk about segue that into who would approach you to have their cards read, and then let's do what to expect when it's happening.
Okay. Well, so the origins of tarot are pretty much unknown. There's a lot of different theories out there. There's old decks. I wish I had a more solid date for you when the first decks were from. I've been meaning to look that up again. But essentially, it came from Italy. There was a game that they used to play called Tarottici. I don't really know too much about that, but it's believed that the Visconti family, which is a very rich Italian family in Italy, they commissioned an artist to put pictures on this Tarottici game. Some believe that it was with esoteric intention to embed religious or spiritual knowledge into the cards. Some just say it was just for fun.
Tell me more about that. Like what would be an example of that? Do you know?
Well, like we had discussed earlier, so one of my favorite things to imagine, right? And this is after being interested in tarot for the last 15 years, right? So in my mind, when I think about the origins of tarot, like I generally, my fantasy is where, books were being burnt, back in Italy. This is just one theory that I read about where, this family, they had basically commissioned an artist to preserve some of this ancient spiritual knowledge into these cards. They actually have a lot of association with Kabbalah and Judaism. So there's actually a lot of religious symbolism in the deck, and that's what I teach about in the classes. If you were to do one with me, we go a little more deeper into those things.
Well,
but it's actually tied to a lot of that.
So I guess what you're saying is at some point in history, and we've heard about it happening a dozen times or so over the course of time, but if books are being burned, then everybody's history is going down with it.
Sure.
And
sure.
if you follow a particular religion or a particular sect of a religion, and all the literature you have that you would pass down to future generations is being destroyed because of the religion, you could hide your message in artwork. Is what you're trying to say.
Sure.
Yeah, that's really cool. You know what? I'm adopting that idea too. I'm adopting that reason. Okay. I really like that one. That makes sense.
Another way that I try to describe the tarot to people too is it's sort of like the world's first movie, right? It's sort of like a picture book of human experience. So if you look at the old decks, though, I want to make a point and say that when you look at the old original tarot decks, they don't look like the Rider-Waite deck, the most common deck there is today, and a lot of the other decks, right? They've transformed a lot over time. The images have grown over time. So people have run with it, I guess you could say.
Elaborated a little bit.
So...
No, I'm saying they elaborated on the cards.
Sure, but here's the interesting part. When I talk about it being the first movie, the first picture book, the human experience, as diverse as it is very stereotypical also,
okay.
Right? So there's these universal archetypes, right? And I think that the best way I go into describing archetypes like this. So in literature, right, when you're talking about, say, like a hero or a villain, right? Those are archetypes. So hero, you have Harry Potter, but you also have Spider-Man, but you also have, you have many incarnations of that. Just like villain, right? Villain is the archetypal energy, right? But you have different interpretations of that. So
gotcha.
These cards, they're universal concepts beneath each one. So although each artist that redraws these archetypes, each artistic, creative, expression is different, stylistically, underpinning that, right, what they're interpreting is an intangible, invisible archetype that's true for everyone.
Got it.
So what's really cool is I love the study of this pattern that you've seen, and what's so interesting to me about tarot is because it's so old. It goes back, but these images and these archetypes are still with us because they're absolutely relevant hundreds and hundreds of years later.
I totally get it.
Okay.
I totally get it. Yeah. That was a really great way of breaking it down. So we've gotten past the assumptions of what it is. I like the idea of it being a picture book, but it's definitely a story I don't know if I've heard. But I bet you're going to tell me it's everybody's story. So, I guess you're going to define the fool's journey, right?
Sure. Well,
but how many journeys are there? There's the fool. Is there somebody else, or is there?
So before we get into that exactly,
Okay.
I want to break down. So everyone's pretty much familiar with a regular deck of cards.
I'm sorry, components of the deck, right?
Sure, right.
Yeah.
Everyone's familiar with a regular deck of cards. There's 4 suits: King, Queen, Jack, right? So what's interesting is tarot is essentially that deck. Okay, so you have those cards. The only thing different about a tarot deck is you have an additional 22 cards. So there's 78 cards in a tarot deck.
Okay.
All right. But the rest of the deck looks very similar to your regular deck of cards and is actually associated with that deck of cards.
You mean like an ace or a
Yep, there's an
5?
ace. Yep. So there's 4 suits.
Really?
All right. Mm-hmm. So, and this is really interesting. So the regular deck of cards that most people are familiar with the King, Queen, Ace, 4 different suits, that regular deck of cards, that is in the tarot deck called the Minor Arcana. There's a Major Arcana and a Minor Arcana. Those are the 2 parts of the deck. So you have those regular cards with your suits and your aces and your kings and your queens, right? You have all those. And then the Major Arcana in the tarot deck is just the trump cards. Or they're not associated with the suit. They're just, that's the fool's journey. So those are an additional
like the Joker
cards.
If you were to play the Joker,
sure,
that'd be one of those cards that's
it'd be the Fool.
Okay, so it's like okay, continue.
This is actually where a regular deck of cards comes from.
Okay.
So
I was starting to pick up on that.
Right. So what's really interesting is if you were to and this is where a lot of connection comes in with tarot when I talk about it, is a lot of people are familiar with yoga. They're familiar with the elements, earth, air, fire, water. So essentially that's what we're dealing with here. When you're thinking about tarot and the suits, right? There are 4 suits and each one represents a different aspect: earth, air, fire, and water.
Wow.
So the cups suit, it's cups, swords, Pentacles, and Wands. So each one is associated with a different element. So with Cups, it's water.
Right.
Right? So when you're dealing with the Cup cards, you're dealing with love, emotion, imagination, everything about you that's watery. Okay?
Okay.
So this is an element in the deck that it discusses, right? Through this suit, through these pictures. That's all the pictures are talking about. That they're relating to that aspect. Swords are air, are sharp, are your mind, are your thoughts, the airy qualities about you.
Okay.
In yoga, Vata, right?
Okay.
If people are familiar with that. So a lot of these concepts will overlap. You have Wands, which is fire, which is everything fire about you. Your sexuality, your passion, your behavior, your action, right? It's all the fiery parts of you, your digestion. And then you have Pentacles, which is everything else. Earth, money, business, wealth, value, the external world.
Okay.
So that's a regular deck of cards. And it's so funny because
and those are the suits.
Those are the suits. And
Gotcha.
so this is real interesting. So think about a regular deck of cards. You're playing poker with your friends, right? Think about it. You have hearts,
Right.
which are cups. You have diamonds, which are swords.
All right.
You have spades, which is like a shovel for earth. And
Oh,
you have
wow.
clubs, which is in the deck. They're wands and they're clubs. They're like actual clubs.
Okay.
Fire clubs to rep. So it's really interesting. So then, and the Joker, like you had mentioned earlier, that's the Fool. But anyway, you have those cards which are representing of the 4 elements, right? Well, what's the 5th element?
Spirit.
Yeah, spirit. So the trump cards, the major arcana, those extra 22 cards are spirit. That is the soul part, the journey of a man's soul. And so once I learned that about tarot, because here's where you go when you are introduced to tarot, you first have to encounter all the cliches, right? Like all the mysticism and devil worship. And once you get over that, if you're like typically a new agey person and you say, screw that, I don't believe it, think tarot cards are cool, you are so overwhelmed. You don't know what's going on. There's 78 cards. There's all these pictures. You've seen it on TV. You flip over a card, it tells your future, right? That's most people's interaction with it at the beginning. But then once you realize what I just explained, that each of these I don't know, I don't want to call them groups, but basically each of these groups of cards are depicting certain elemental forces, things like that. Once you start to break it down, then you start to realize, you're getting into what the tarot can do for you, in terms of studying it. So so for me, once I figured out that, tarot isn't just this tool to choose a card at random, what it actually is a thing that I want to study. Because think about it, if you have the journey of a man's soul, the beginning's really easy, but man, I was like, I want to know what the end cards mean, right? What's in store for me? I'm only 30, like what's going to happen, right?
Right, yeah.
So I'm curious because there's all this ancient wisdom in it, right? It has persisted, tarot has persisted in our culture for this long, and become this huge thing. So, I was really curious to study that. But the thing is, there's not an easy answer for it, right?
Let's make sure I'm not getting off track in my own head. So, the elements are the part of the world that we can easily understand, which is air, earth.
Mm-hmm.
What were they again?
Earth, air, fire, water.
Yes. And those are in the deck, but they're kind of tertiary to this 5th element, which is the spirit.
Sure.
Okay. And then these 22 cards, which I'm actually looking at on a piece of paper right now, these will help tell a story that I assume can change from one reading to the next to help you process the path of your spiritual, of your spiritual development.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. So I think I'm tracking.
So in the 4 elements, right, these are sort of like you mentioned, they're mundane stories, if you will, compared to the bigger story, the big spiritual story, which is the major arcana, hence the major and the minor.
Gotcha.
So in each of these elements, even though earth, air, fire, water, exist around us, in the tarot, they really represent those aspects of yourself.
Right.
So the suit of Pentacles is your journey through the wealth and abundance journey. You know, the swords tells a story, its own story of your journey with your mind and your mental airy aspects of yourself. Cups, your emotional world, et cetera, right? So,
Okay.
but then, so those are considered the mundane cards or the minor arcana. And then this major arcana, you know, really, they are suitless. They embody all the suits, right? They're more integrated. So this
Right.
is a more integrated journey. So, and yes, when you do a reading, or in the sense, we'll say, if we shuffle the cards and pull them at random, it is very good at demonstrating and reflecting back to you this really dynamic life that we live in, right? So it's actually, that's why it works so well for people to use them that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Too, because each one is associated to you. It's just each one is a small mirror of you and of every person. So, but once you start to understand the how the deck was created and how it's built. So this is really funny, and I want to connect what we were talking about engineering a little bit, because it's a funny segue. Most people, when they find out, they're like, engineering, and then you're like a bartender and a waitress and a tarot card reader? Like, what happened, you know? But actually, it was really funny. My first, I used to be a soil tech, like I said, and I was kind of doing tarot at the same time. They overlapped a little bit. And we had this joke. My first like attempt at a business was called Soul Tech Tarot, because in engineering, right, when you're building something, the foundation is the most important part. And so what I learned is learning the foundation of tarot, right, and creating a spiritual foundation for yourself is also important. So I've been in foundation work this whole time, whether it's with engineering or tarot. But do you know what I mean? So I've always been.
That's clever. Yeah.
I'm also a spiritual engineer. So as much
spiritual
as
engineer. That is awesome. Okay.
So what I like to do, because I think there's a lot of readers out there and a lot of people that do tarot, and they do use it for some sort of psychic medium intention. That, however, is not mine. I like to think of myself more as a teacher, to teach what I've learned. And for me, in my mathematical brain, is to break the deck down into pieces and study each one into the integrated whole.
All the psychic stuff and the, you know, sometimes people just need stuff like that. And sometimes people get unhealthy with it and they get too dependent on it. But, you know, having a conversation with somebody who says they can know what you're feeling, or they can predict the future, or they can tell you your past when they don't know you, it's just a conversation.
Right.
And it's a connection you have with a stranger or somebody you know. But it's not all bad. It's just somebody's outlet at the time. It might be what they need. It might help them think more clearly. It's like a version of meditation to some extent. It helps you reflect. So I wouldn't worry people can always hate on the mysticism of tarot and the stereotypes. That makes sense, and people always will. But in an all accepting environment, or in an environment of trying to learn about something new, which is what this conversation is, you know, don't worry about that part. I think you're talking to me, you know, and I'm understanding what you're saying. And anybody who would think that this is a goofy, who aren't open-minded at this point in the recording,
right,
they're not even listening. So anybody you've got right now, and you've got me. I'm listening, and I'm eager to learn more. But really, don't worry about that stuff anymore. Like, just tell me. Spiritual engineer is a incredibly awesome title. So tell me what's next. Keep going.
Well, I'll talk a little bit more about my background. You know, it's interesting. Everything has seemed to serendipitously come together, right? A lot of these concepts, like I was saying, I've found a lot of similar threads like running through my life. And like I said, this foundation work, breaking things down into, you know, chunks and steps, and, you know, really mastery of self has been a big deal for me over time. And I'm getting a little off track now.
You want to bring it back?
Yeah. Sorry, you got my head spinning. There's so many things to think about right now.
I do that in all the podcasts. I ask questions because it's not just a presentation.
Sure.
It's just a conversation.
No, I know.
And like I said, our goal in this conversation is to teach me 2 or 3 things and then allow me to ask some questions, because you probably could have your very own podcast about tarot, and that's totally possible. I would even help you with it, because this is a hobby of mine. This podcasting is a huge hobby of mine. I just love learning about new things, and I'd be hurting myself if I only chose things I had heavy interest in.
Sure.
So I want to know about this, and I think the part that we were, based on our pre-discussion, the next part is the journey of the Fool. Because the sexy part of this is looking at all these colorful artist renditions of something on these different fifth element cards. So why don't you explain to me the journey of the Fool then?
Okay.
Is that explainable, or do you have to do a reading, or what?
No. Well, I guess that's what I was trying to say, is that you don't have to do a reading and choose the cards at random. You gain a lot of this wisdom by looking at the cards in their numbered order. All the cards are numbered, right?
Okay.
So I find a lot of satisfaction of going through the deck, how it was built, and understanding that foundational cohesiveness, right? So that if you do choose to pull the cards at random, you're not just, getting on the internet, looking up some random meaning, like some fortune cookie sort of interpretation, which I think has given tarot a bad rap.
Sure.
So this is sort of where I'm going with that. So, but yeah, the Fool's Journey, this is what I teach in the first workshop that I do. I do like an introductory workshop.
Wait a minute. A question I had earlier was, the Fool's Journey, are there other journeys?
Like I mentioned, in the rest of the cards are that minor arcana. So yes, that the journey
Down
of the water, the mind, your passions, those are encompassed in the regular deck.
So the primary character, and again, this is just breaking it down for Brackens.
Yeah.
The Fool is the primary character.
Sure.
Sure or yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. So there's nobody else. So the only person who goes on a journey at this point is the Fool.
Yes.
We are all the Fool?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I didn't know there's another card that goes through another journey, so okay.
Yeah, so it starts at 0. There's 21, there's numbered up to 21 cards because you're including 0. And like you mentioned, sort of the Joker card, right?
Right.
In the deck. So 0 is a very powerful number. So the tarot really overlaps with a lot of other practices, right? So numerology, even astrology, yoga, etc. So you'll find if you are into any of those things, tarot can really accompany your practice and on that journey. So you have a lot of numerology. So 0 in numerology is very much this empty vessel, right? It's the non-number, if you will, right? Just how like black is sort of an absence of color. So you have, everyone starts out as 0, an empty vessel. We are born innocent and open. And then essentially, as I study the tarot and these archetypes, I imagine the Fool, he's sort of like an Alice in Wonderland, right? Starting off on this adventure. He's encountering each of these archetypes along the way, right?
Is starting off on the adventure birth? Like, is it birth? Like, again, I'm trying to put myself in the role of the Fool here.
Yeah, you could go there. So it is birth in one sense. That's one beginning, right? But there are many that you encounter in your life, right? So like you said, Break It Down with Brackens is very much you, the Fool, at the beginning of each podcast,
True.
Right? So like I was mentioning hero and villain before, these are archetypal things that manifest them over and over again in different ways, right? So the Fool... So
it's not over a whole lifetime. It could be just a phase of your life.
Sure. So you can't... Exactly. So that's a good point. So you can overlay it over top of your sort of birth to death experience.
Okay.
Or you could do it in a smaller thing with a smaller issue, So... Which makes, I think, tarot very accessible because you can use it over and over again like that. So, but I like to think of it as, yes, the Fool's on a journey, right? And pictured in the cards, because I know everyone can't see this necessarily. It's just a young gentleman. He's carefree, and he's got a little dog with him, and he's on the edge of a cliff, okay? So this is what's so interesting about this, right? And so each card stands on its own as an important message. You could think of these cards, there's 78 in the deck, 78 degrees of wisdom, right? Each can stand alone with its own powerful message. So the Fool, the message in and of itself, right? So he's about to jump off the cliff, but he thinks that he can fly, right? So some say that's taking a leap of faith, or some say it's foolish, it's folly, right? So there's a good connotation and a bad connotation to every single card. There's a multiple of ways you can look at this card on its own merit, right? You could say that he's carefree, or you could say that he's a fool, like an idiot, right? Because there are times in your life where you can be foolish in a negative way, or times where you can take a leap of faith, right?
And to some extent, they're both the same.
Right, exactly. So it's super powerful. So one of the reasons that I really like tarot is over a lot of other sort of religious experiences for me is because it's very balanced in the masculine and feminine. And this is really important to point out because, you know, for me, when I think about like the Bible, it's like Moses and Jesus and Paul and John, and, you know, there's lots of men and even Buddha and da-da-da-da. So actually in the tarot deck, for every masculine card, there is a feminine card. There's always duality. It's a very yin-yang sort of experience. So each individual card, just like the Fool, has like dual meanings, if you will, or maybe a positive connotation and a negative connotation to each like core concept. I think that, you know, that's what really appeals to me is this duality. And I think it's really important foundationally, right, as a foundational piece of understanding the tarot is to understand that the deck is built in this way. And it acknowledges the duality in just about everything.
Okay.
So, right. So I point that out so that you take that with you as I talk about the Fool's Journey a little bit, because it's this duality that essentially the deck is attempting to integrate. This is the satisfaction you get from understanding the deck and gaining mastery with it, is to understand that it's just a tool to help you integrate.
Okay. So the next step is?
So the Fool goes through this journey, and the way that to make it simple for everyone, because there are 21 cards, I don't want to go through each individual card because that would take all day.
Right.
But there's 3 legs of the journey, right? So everybody's familiar with 21. 7 into 21 is 3.
Gotcha.
3 times 7, 21. 7 feels like a very magical, powerful number, right? 7 days in a week, things like that. So again, if you're into numerology, a lot of this will have weight for you.
Okay. So
essentially the Fool goes through 3 legs of this journey. And so even though I said I was a spiritual engineer, the further I progress into healing work, I realize a lot of it's psychological, at least for me. So the way that I break it down, the legs of this journey, right? So 7 cards in each journey. Those first 7 cards that the Fool encounters are called the worldly sequence, and this is essentially the building of your coping mechanisms in your psychology. This is where, when you're young, you're developing your mask, if you will, your psychological personality.
Who you are, yes.
Who you are. Who you think you are, or maybe who others think you are, right? Or exactly. What society expects of you, right?
Yeah, the mask, right.
Sure.
Schema.
So you have the paper there, and if you look at those cards, the Magician, the High Priestess, that's just willpower, consciousness, subconsciousness, right? Masculine aggression, not in a negative way, but then feminine receptivity. So those are 2 parts of a person, our consciousness and our unconsciousness, right? So that the Fool encounters those first. Then you see the Empress and the Emperor. Feminine, mother energy, nature, creation energy. Then the Emperor energy, which is sort of like, yes, nature's beautiful and bees are buzzing, and that's one feminine aspect of nature, right? Growth, creation. But then there's also the thunderstorm. Dad's got to kill a deer for us to survive. You know, the tiger kills the antelope, right? There's the darker side.
Sure.
So you have the Fool encounters this sort of mom energy, dad energy. And then the next one there is the Hierophant, which is institutions and schools and society and structure and time, right? And then the Lovers, you get into this sort of naked freedom, experiencing relationships and your sexuality. Finally culminates in the Chariot, right? This guy's not the Fool anymore, right? He's got a car, he's got a job, he's moved out of the house, right?
Gotcha.
So what's really interesting is the Fool then graduates to this awareness of the Chariot, right? So he's the first leg of the journey. He integrates 1 and 2, integrates 3 and 4, and 5 and 6, and then becomes number 7.
Gotcha.
So so when the Fool learns to integrate his conscious and unconscious, his feminine, that mom energy, dad energy, and reconcile those, and the discipline of our lives, like school, work, whatever, with the visceral parts of ourselves, right? The wild part that wants to go and party and rage and do whatever, right? So once you reconcile that, you get to a level of mastery that is in the Chariot there at the end. And so you're doing this 2 more times. That makes sense.
Right, and that's on the practical plane.
Sure, exactly. That's on the practical plane, and
again, that means that's the world we are physically in.
Yes.
Okay.
So then
hold on. So the Fool, I'm still stuck with the image in my head of pulling cards.
Sure.
So you're talking about doing the cards in an order.
Yes.
Are you reflecting on each card as you look at it, as to where you are with the relationship to that card in your practical plane?
So are you asking how this ties into a reading where you would pick cards at random to interpret?
I think I'm blurring the two types of what the stereotype of reading cards is versus reading them in order.
Well, like I said, what we're going over right now is just sort of the foundational understanding of how the deck was drawn and built.
Gotcha.
And I think there's a lot of wisdom in and of how this thing was put together.
Gotcha.
I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, let's stick on that path then, because I'm just and that's the hard part for me, is just to...
Because so this is why I teach tarot to other people. So I require people to have their own decks, right? I empower you to learn this for yourself, so that when and if you do pull cards at random, you can, in your mind, say, oh, I pulled this card, and then you have a deeper understanding of that card because you learned the context in the story, right? Because what happens is it overwhelms people. When they go to Shepherdstown, they go to On the Wings of Dreams, they pick up this cool, trendy, hip tarot deck. They have a ton of tarot decks in there and crystals, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to get my magic on. I'm going to buy a crystal, and I'm going to get this tarot deck.
Okay.
And they're all excited, and they get it home, and they shuffle it, and they pull some cards, some past, present, future, whatever they're going to pull cards on. They look up some spread on the internet, and then they pull these cards at random, and then they call me up, and they're like, Katie, I got these cards, and I have no idea what they mean.
Right, yeah.
So this is why I started teaching about the story in and of itself, because then you're empowered to understand each of these cards in their individual way once you see them as part of a whole story. So this is really just, I provide that foundational information so that when you do play with the cards and you pull them at random, you're not just looking up a fortune cookie meaning on the internet, because there's tons of them. Scammy stuff out there that it ruins. So we actually in the workshop have to talk to people about, a lot of them had bad experiences going to a tarot reader or some psychic, right? Some sort of scammy thing with a big life decision, right? Because most people don't go for a reading. Like sometimes it's a fun girls' night, you're just playing around, sleepover style, or sometimes, you're really struggling with a life choice, and you get to the point where you're like, I'm going to go, call a psychic about it or something, and they tell you some detrimental information, right? So a lot of people feel that the power is in the reader's hands, but I like to put the power in your hands by just understanding.
Because you can read them. You can read them yourself.
Sure, because really they're you. So I like to leave it up to you what you gather from me educating you on the story. Because now I think, piquing your interest and saying, okay, so what happens now? So now the Fool's the Chariot. Well, then what, right? So he's looks pretty successful, right? He's integrated a lot of this stuff. He's encountered it. He's built his mask. He's built his personality, right? So what's the problem?
So the Chariot, you can only become the Chariot once you've come to terms with your masculine or feminine side of the first two, second two, and third two. Is that kind of how that works?
Sure. Yeah,
but at the same time, you had a phase around in between the two of each set.
Sure. I think once you start getting into a deeper study of tarot, it'll start to become more clear that you're in all these cards at one time. These are just facets of you,
right,
in all times, right? There's always mother energy running through the world, and father energy, Fool energy, structure energy, wild energy, right? So you're really, these are archetypes are always in play, just like your chakras. You know how you're supposed to move up through the chakras, but it's not like you move up through one and it's done. You're constantly in flux with all of them. So you want to keep them in balance. So
whoa.
You know.
Yeah, I'm not totally dialed in with chakras yet
Okay,
either.
let me. You know, this is actually a great analogy because you're an athletic person, and I know you've been to a yoga class or two. So you know how each yoga pose is there, right? Down dog, right? But downward dog on Sunday isn't necessarily the same as downward dog on Wednesday for you, right? Each pose you do again and again. The cards are just like that. Each one of is their own yoga pose. Okay? So you can consider that yoga pose separate, right? Or you can do a sequence, like a class, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was figuring, was that you would be one card a little bit more on at one time in your life and a little bit different another.
Exactly, which is why I think people have fun pulling cards at random, because they will pull the card that corresponds to what is magnified in their life at that time, and they'll just keep pulling that card over and over again, like just at random, which is pretty interesting for a lot of people, which is why I think people feel that it's magical.
Yeah.
Because they will continually visit concepts in the deck that tend to reflect exactly what they're going through at a certain time. And if that shift focuses, or if there's a refocus or a shifting, a lot of times the cards that they'll draw will reflect that, focus. But that's sort of,
no, I get
to me, again, that's the mysticism part of it a little bit. But
we're starting to run out of time. So
Okay.
let's briefly go over the mental plane and the spiritual plane. And then I want to make sure we have time to, and we have about 12 minutes left.
Okay.
And I want to make sure we discuss a little more details about your class and some of the other things you have coming up and things that you want to do.
Sure.
I know. So tell me about the mental plane. How is that different than the practical?
So once you're at this level of, external success, a lot of people have this moment. If you're into astrology, it's called your Saturn Return. You're about 29. You finally have something to come out of, right? You've lived your 20s, and now you actually have a life to sort of reflect on. You've built something, and then now you can consider it. So the second line, the next 7 cards, is called Turning Inward. And this is where, it starts out with some familiar cards that a lot of people have seen, like the Hermit card, right? The Led Zeppelin, that's really the Hermit tarot card. In their one album,
Yeah,
right?
I see,
So like that image, you call that up in your mind. That's the beginning of turning inward. That's where you finally have, sort of an introspective period to sort of see who's behind the mask, right? You've created this mask, this personality, this life, and then so a lot of times people, especially people in their later 30s, will really start to connect with. From 29 to 30, you start to get into this period, and a lot of those cards really reflect that shift where you realize maybe some of the ways that you act. I call it the script, and a lot of people are familiar with this. So a lot of people are doing things based on what they've been trained to do, or they're operating on a certain belief system maybe. And I think this is why tarot has become really popular today, is because a lot of people are concerned with authenticity now. Authenticity is a focus for people. And I think that what's happening is in this second line of cards is the Carl Jung sort of ego death, right? Where you stop being run by your ego and you start connecting with your true self. So essentially the second line of the deck, that's why the death card is in there. So a lot of people, the mystical thing is, the death card, right? It's at the end there. See that? You get into the death card.
I feel like that's at the death. I thought
Yes,
I was looking at devil. Sorry.
So once the hermit goes into this hermitage, right, he comes out of his hermitage and sees the Wheel of Fortune, that next card. See that? It's a big circle. It's this big rotating disc in the sky. And really what it is the hermit gets off the hamster wheel for a second. Because when you're in it, you're just running in it. But eventually you can start to have an out-of-body experience and sort of look at life in general, your life in general, see your own ups and downs, right? And see that you're running on a script, your fight or flight response. You start to, know thyself, right? You get into this period where you're like, everything around me changes, but my principles don't need to change. Like inside your internal compass, right? So it really just has all these deep things. You go inside, you have a really reflective period. You understand your ego, your shadow self. It's, to me, it's the difference between reacting and responding. in a lot of ways. So this is these. So in the second line of cards, if you were to go in deeper into studying them, you would learn a lot of significant things about how we as humans develop self-awareness, essentially, right? And when you achieve that, you get to this Temperance card at the end, right?
Just about to ask you that, yeah.
So Temperance means, moderation, essentially. It's balance. It's a new level of alchemy.
So self-awareness, being confident in who you become,
right?
Realizing that your mask and your personality is. I think I really get that.
Right.
I really do, and
there's a lot of meat there,
yeah.
right? So, and this is just a really sort of surface look at it, but that's what's so interesting and why you can keep coming back to tarot. Why I've been into it for almost 16 years now.
Right.
So it's because it's really, really rich with study. So I try to encourage people to understand that there's depth there. It's not just, I looked it up I Googled the meaning of this card and it told me and that's it, right? There's a lot of context that goes into it.
You've said this is similar to yoga and other studies.
Sure. It's definitely a practice.
So with yoga, there's practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've done yoga on and off for, I don't even know,
mm-hmm.
years and years and years. I'm not practicing as hard as I should be or as much as I should be. And frankly, you don't need to practice all the time anyways, but I know the more you practice, the more efficient you become at it.
Sure.
I imagine the study of tarot is on the same line. Not
It
only
is.
are you studying what they mean, how they work together on each plane, but I imagine as you journey through your own life, you start to understand them more and more.
Absolutely.
And temperance changes 5 years from now compared
Sure.
to what it is
100%,
now. Right?
Which just makes it very rich.
I like that. Okay, so spiritual plane.
So, once you really, look behind the mask, you still have this mask on. And I think that third line, it's called the Great Journey. And to be honest with you, it's challenging for me to fully understand the Great Journey, truly, because I'm there in that, but I've come to master that first and second line. I'm still in those, mastery
Sure.
of that. That third line was really just that integration between, wow, I've explored the depth of my soul. Just like when Star Wars, when Luke goes into the cave, right, and he confronts his demons, right, and it's Darth Vader, and he cuts his head off, and they takes the mask off, and it's himself, right? So a lot of this stuff, why I think tarot's popular today, because shadow work is getting more and more popular, which is looking at the parts of yourselves that you don't look at, your parts of yourself that you've repressed, right?
That's shadow work?
Shadow work, looking behind the mask. That's really what shadow work is looking into your unconscious, right? And what's propelling you. So in one way, it's that script and it's, your belief system, confronting yourself. It's hard for people to look in the mirror, right? And I think with this COVID-19 thing, I think this is what is really challenging for people, right? You can't just go and keep yourself busy all the time. It's hard to be alone. It's hard to sit with yourself, right? So this is the challenge of the second line of tarot. And the challenge is essentially the whole deck. So this is when you sit down, whether you're doing introspective work with tarot, doing a tarot reading, that's what it is. It's looking into a mirror to help you understand yourself, which is a challenge. It's not easy, I don't think. And so the cards, actually, if you go into deeper study, will reflect the challenge of that. So if you look at the Hanged Man right before the Death card, he's stuck there. He's not hanged as in noosed, right? He's hanging upside down. That's actually ties back to having a moment of an aha moment. You look at the little crown of light around his head.
Right,
He's having an aha moment, but things don't change until the death comes in and cuts him down, right? So we all can understand change, but it's a fearful prospect when everything does change. So the Hanged Man, he's in limbo there. A lot of people get stuck for a while before change actually happens, right? Kind of like, you should eat healthy, but doesn't mean you're going to execute on that, right? So that's why it comes at the end of that concept there is you really integrate that. You start to not only understand, but start to live. So that Great Journey, that last leg of the journey, the last 7 cards, what it really does is just give you a path. And it's very esoteric. It's hard to understand. I've studied it for a long time, but there is wisdom in there. I won't get into too much detail with it. But essentially, it gives you clues as to how to integrate that and some sort of comfort along the way, because this is a very human journey. And just how I said black is sort of the absence of color, white is sort of the inclusion of all colors. So you get to the end of this journey, and I want you to take a look at the World card, that last card.
Right.
that wreath of victory that she's floating in, that's the 0. Now the 0 is full.
I see.
You see? And only a fool would jump from that place, right?
Right.
So this cycles over and over again. So this is really in a circle. So the next card after 22 is we're back at 0 again, right? Because you constantly are doing this. You're constantly entering new awarenesses. It's a really beautiful process. So
well, I can see that, and you did a great job of breaking down how it may have been the first picture book.
Yeah.
And I can also see how different instructors or different people who understand it would tell the story or the designations a little bit differently too, and then how it's explained kind of is based on how you personally interpret it also.
Yeah.
So that ties me into this program that you're running. Is it a program or a class, or what is it?
Well, if a lot of local people are listening to this, I'm sure you're familiar with Moving Mountains Yoga Studio. If not, it's over by M Street Bakery. It's fairly new.
That's in Ranson.
In Ranson, yep. And I've had the pleasure of working with Whitney Ingram, who owns a studio, and because of a lot of this overlap with the practice of yoga and the practice of tarot, actually a lot of people call tarot yoga off the mat, if you will. So, exploring our friendship and our, mutual interests in healing and practices and whatnot, we've done a few workshops, and we're going to continue to do them. So I definitely am looking to expand my one-on-one work with people, absolutely. But yeah, so far we've offered a couple of workshops. Things have gotten stalled a little bit, as everybody knows, with the virus and everything. So I'm not sure when the next one will be. But yeah, so.
Well, I love what Whitney's doing, but she's kind of doing a like a little fast food version of yoga on like Facebook Live and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I really should. I would love to start doing. I'm actually trying to put together right now some way I can do one-on-ones with people over the internet, like I said. But usually I tend to like the class and the workshop format, to be honest, because it is a lot of teaching, right?
Sure, yeah.
So it is fun to have a group to teach to.
How long is the class?
It's about 2.5 hours.
Is it one visit or multiple?
So it's multiple. So we broke down earlier the different components of the deck. So in the introductory workshop, so if you were to work with me one-on-one, this is how it works. An introductory session with me is about 3 hours. It's $150, and I teach you you get your base foundational knowledge, and I go in depth with you on the major arcana. Then every session after that is about an hour for $50 after that.
Wow.
And then we go into a little bit more of the minor cards right there. So I actually have my complete tarot workshop is a 6-week endeavor.
Nice.
So
that's good to know.
Right.
And what you're doing is you're coaching people to be able to read the cards in order for the most part.
Yeah. So I'm giving a lot of empowerment. To each person comes with their own deck, right? And I give you a lot of resources, right? And we go into a lot of depth, and so also not only do I teach about the tarot in and of itself, if you want to empower yourself as your own reader, but I do advanced high-level coaching on how to do advanced spreads, if you will. So you had mentioned before a lot of, the drawing cards thing, that's what you go to. And for a lot of people, that's what they do. They even learn about the deck, and then they're still shuffling the cards, pulling them at random. So I actually do, my favorite things to do are what's called a prosperity mandala. So I work with you, and we go do a lot of introspective journaling work, and we work with the cards. We go through intentionally. We don't pick them at random, but we go through and pick intentional cards, defining what prosperity means to you, whether it's work, life, relationships, health, whatever. And I kind of teach you how to work with the cards in that way to manifest something that you want, or to get clarity on certain things. So there's, in one way there's teaching. I love it. That's awesome. In one way there's really teaching about the deck, so you can understand the meanings of the cards and like what we just discussed today. But then on another level, once you get acquainted with that deck, I teach you how to really use it and structure it in a way that can help you, aid you in your journaling, in your meditation. What's really great with Whitney and I, we pull in the seasonal aspect. Right now, like we're in Aries, we're in spring. We talk about concepts that people are familiar with, say like Vata. People are, familiar with that in a sort of Ayurvedic sense or whatever. But then
What? What does that even? What?
Well, if you're into yoga, that's the sister science of yoga.
Okay.
Which relates to the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, like we talked about before. So if you have any prior knowledge, you can build upon that, right, to deepen your understanding. Okay. So I do a lot of coaching on that too, and I'm a beginner at this too. So I've known tarot a long time, but as far as working with the public, it's been a new experience, and I'm very impressed at everyone's interest in it. Typically, the people that come to the workshops have been so far just women. Mm-hmm. And it's been a nice way to connect with other women and talk about really intellectual subjects, honestly. So.
Well, I love it. Thank you for explaining at what I assume was a very basic level to me on that. But I feel so much more connected to you now.
Okay.
Because originally it was hard for us to break down how to communicate about something that I have no idea about. But what you've done, at least for the practical and the mental plane, you've definitely given me some very good insight. And I have a totally different outlook on what tarot cards are now. If somebody wanted to learn more or somebody had questions for you, how could they get a hold of you?
Well, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. My last name's kind of hard, but I'm sure you're going to have that in writing.
Oh, yeah.
On the thing. Well, yeah, Katie Bochinski. You can friend request me, DM me, send me an email. It's katiebochinski@gmail.com. Right now I am working to try to figure out a platform for myself so people can access me a little bit better. Like I said, I've been doing my workshops through Moving Mountains Yoga Studio with Whitney. We've been branching out. We even did one at a different yoga studio, Branches of Yoga in Sykesville, Maryland. So just keep on the lookout for that. If you want to follow either of those studios, we'll probably have more upcoming workshops. Yeah. So.
Well, Katie, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on this. And actually, people definitely don't know this, but Katie has been a sounding board for me for over a year. I bump into her, and we just have long conversations about things I had coming up, things she had coming up. And I'm glad you get to finally be on the podcast.
Yeah,
You're
I love
episode
this.
40, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
and,
I'm excited.
I know, like, literally, what was it? 3 months ago, we were sitting at Panera.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a little longer than that, talking about what direction you were trying to go. And I was like, check out this idea about this crazy podcast. And, you know.
Right.
Well, good. Thank you so much for being on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by City National Bank in Ransom, West Virginia. I am Melissa Knott and manage both of our Jefferson County locations. Our Charlestown location is located on George Street in Charlestown, and the Ransom location is located in the Potomac Marketplace Shopping Center. City National Bank is a full-service community bank that provides an array of financial services. We offer a range of free checking accounts and savings products for both consumer and business customers. City National Bank offers competitive low-rate and low-cost lending products for both business and personal needs. Come and talk to me or one of my team members and get products and services that are tailored to fit your schedule and help you to achieve your financial goals. I can be reached at both the Ransom and Charlestown locations. Check out our website at www.bankatscity.com.
Today's intro song is called Mean in a Good Way. It's written and performed by Peter Clark off of his album Peter Clark After Dark. Peter describes this song as being the best song to learn hula hooping to. Peter is an avid hooper and recently started a hula hoop repair business. If you ever need hula hoop repair, consider contacting Peter. You can reach him on SoundCloud. Just search Peter Clark After Dark.